I was walking in the school hallway when the emergency alarm went off and everyone started panicking. When I looked out of the window, you wouldn't believe what I saw. There was rain, wind, and chaos. It was hard to even see anything. And that's when something hit the window I was looking through and glass spread all over the floor, which caused everyone to scream and panic even more. This was an emergency, and everyone's lives were in danger at that second. Teachers, security guards, and other school staff were shouting at us students to get into the hallway in the middle of the school, away from the windows, and get down on the floor. But students were pushing each other, screaming, and some were even trying to run for the doors. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't breathe. This had been my worst fear for so long. I was so afraid of natural disasters. Some of my friends were afraid of spiders, some were afraid of snakes, heights, and then there was me, terrified of storms. I don't know when it started. I was just always afraid from the time I was a little kid. I would see things on the news about tsunamis and earthquakes and hurricanes around the world and be terrified that things like that were going to happen in my town. My parents didn't take me seriously. They kept saying tsunamis and earthquakes didn't happen where we lived. They knew that hurricanes were a possibility, but they said it was very, very rare. They would tease me about my fear of storms. My classmates were the same way. Anytime there was a thunderstorm and I would start to get jumpy, they would laugh and say maybe it would turn into a hurricane. There was one girl, Kaylin, who would say stuff like that until I had a panic attack. But who was laughing now? Now we were in the middle of an actual storm, bigger than anything I'd seen. Some of the adults are trying to stay calm, trying to be leaders, but there was just too much chaos. More windows shattered. I was crouched on the floor with my arms over my head, and I swear I could feel the wind rushing through the school. I wondered if it would be strong enough to lift me up and carry me away. There was nothing I could hold on to. Beside me, a girl was crying. People were still trying to take their phones out and call their families. Teachers yelled at them to put their phones away and cover their heads. It seemed to go on for hours, and the longer it went on, the more terrified I was for my parents. They'd never believed the threat of a natural disaster like this was real. They didn't have a plan in place. What if they were hurt or dead? The girl beside me hadn't stopped crying. I suddenly realized it was Kaylin. "Shut up," I muttered to her, but I doubt she heard me over the howling wind outside. The school was made of brick, but I was still terrified that it could blow over, that I would be crushed to death in the rubble. The winds finally started to die down. I couldn't believe it, but it seems like maybe we had actually survived this. Now that the rain was no longer driving against the building and windows were no longer shattering, I could hear sirens everywhere. I assumed it wouldn't be long now until they let us go home, but they didn't. 1 hour went by. Nobody seemed to know anything. A teacher had tried to turn on the radio, but it wasn't working. The adults just kept saying that we couldn't leave until we were given the all clear. But the all clear by who? And what were we supposed to do about our families? I could feel myself breathing too hard, sweat running down under my arms. I was having a panic attack. I used to have them when I was a kid during thunderstorms. My mom would tell me to toughen up. My dad would laugh. Suddenly, I jumped to my feet. "I need to go home," I shouted. "I need to find my parents." A teacher yelled at me to get down, but I wouldn't. I need to find them. And then I started running for the door. The teacher grabbed me by the arm. It felt like my arm was going to wrench out of its socket. "You need to stay here," she said. "When it's safe, a rescue team will start to escort students home." I fought, screaming and crying. I knew everyone was staring at me, but I didn't care. I had to get out of here. Finally, I was too exhausted to fight anymore, and I slumped onto the floor with my classmates. I waited. 2 more hours. My stomach was growling, and I was so exhausted it was hard to keep my eyes open. But at the same time, my heart was pounding, and I felt like I would never sleep again. All I could think about was my parents. My phone had been lost somewhere in the chaos. Other people's phones had no signal, or their batteries were dead. I had never known helplessness like this before. Just having to sit and wait, having no idea what was going on. When was the rescue team coming? How bad was the damage? Eventually, a rescue team entered the school. I started to stand and run toward them, but other people were standing too, all of them asking if they could go home, asking for information about their families. At that moment, I knew I would hit people, shove them out of the way if I had to. I would do whatever it took to get out of there and get home. For the next few minutes, teachers shouted at us while the rescuers tried to talk to us in calm tones. We were on the verge of becoming a mob. Someone elbowed me by accident. Others stepped on my toes. I was afraid I'd be crushed. I blanked for a while, and when I finally came back to myself, I was being led out of the school by a rescuer. The sight that greeted me as I walked outside is one that I will never forget or understand. There was destruction everywhere. Streets were flooded, cars were abandoned on the side of the road, some of them flipped over. Sirens wailed all around. The sky was still gray and murky. Shops that I had known all my life had their windows broken, their walls busted apart. Stray pets paddled in the floodwaters or took shelter on higher ground. I stared at it all, feeling numb. My family only lived about 6 blocks from the school. Was this what our street looked like? Our neighborhood? Our house? I tried to run again, but a rescuer pulled me back. "You can't do that," he said. "You're still in danger. The flooding is bad. There are diseases you can get from the water. The winds are still high. Stay with me." I told him I needed to get home. He said they were taking me to a shelter. "But what about my parents?" I demanded. "We'll take your information at the shelter. We'll do our best to contact any of your relatives, but it could take some time." "I can't wait. I have to know. We live just over there." I pointed and told him the name of my development. He stared at me for a moment. "Most of those houses are destroyed. Anyone who was in them hopefully either went to a storm shelter or basement, or they evacuated. My parents wouldn't leave without me, would they?" I begged the guy to let me go to my house, but he wouldn't let me. He pulled me away, even as I kept trying to run toward my neighborhood to start searching the town for my parents. I was taken to a shelter along with the rest of my classmates, and there we waited even longer until it grew dark. There was a little food at the shelter, but I didn't feel like eating. I couldn't believe something I'd been afraid of my entire life had actually come true. Part of the thing about phobias was that they were supposed to be slightly unrealistic. When my friend Kelly freaked out about spiders, how many spiders were there that could actually kill her around here? Almost none. My parents had always called the possibility of a natural disaster slim. But here I was in this desolate wasteland, my home destroyed, and no way to contact my parents. A kid at the shelter tried to be nice to me. He talked to me about his house, how he hoped it was still standing, how he wanted to find out if his little sister had been evacuated from the elementary school. He offered to play cards with me. I just sat and waited. I must have slept at some point on the cold floor at the shelter. It was the next morning before we started to get information on our families. It was devastating to watch people find out that their family members were dead or injured, but I kept an eye on the people who were being told that their relatives were safe, that they could see them soon. I prayed that would be me. Finally, around noon, I got a call. My parents were in the hospital recovering. My mom was mostly okay, just scratched up, but my dad had lost his leg. I was in shock. None of it seemed real. If it weren't for the fact that I could look out the window and see the destruction all around me, I wouldn't have believed it. How would my dad get along without his leg? Was he at risk for the injury becoming infected? Did the hospital have enough staff to give everyone the treatment they needed? A police officer took me to the hospital. I practically ran into my parents' room. My dad was pretty out of it. I tried not to look at his bandaged stump. I just told him how glad I was that he was alive. My mom, too. They said that they had worried about me for hours. They hadn't been able to get in touch with school. Nobody knew anything. My mom said it was the scariest time of her entire life. We sat there together all afternoon. We didn't talk about the future, where we would live now, how long my dad would have to be in the hospital. For now, we just concentrated on being together. We'd lost everything else, but not each other. My mom said to me, "I'm sorry we didn't take your fears seriously. This just goes to show all of us that life can change in an instant, that your worst nightmares can come true." I didn't know what to tell her. I guess I was still in shock. But in some way, knowing that I had survived this made me feel like that fear wasn't going to be as big a part of my life anymore. Yes, I would always worry when I saw a storm coming. I would always wonder if this could happen again. I knew now that I had the strength to see it through. And now the people I loved knew that it was a real possibility, and hopefully they would be more cautious. We were together now. We'd been given a second chance. Together, I hoped we'd survive the aftermath, too. Did you like my story? Please share your comments below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more.